welcome to everyone. It is my honor to get to introduce our guest today. A couple things I would love to say about him. So Leidy Klotz, maybe we can join here together in the spotlight. I will add a spot. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'll join you in just a second, I think. There we go. Hi, Leidy. Surprise. It is really lovely to have you here today. I have to tell you a story to the audience. So when we wanted to get to meet Leidy, Bob, actually, one of our colleagues, Bob Sutton, wanted to reach out to get to know him in a project they're working on. He said, oh, like if I want to get to talk to Leidy, I better get somebody to introduce me. You know how sometimes you have these people that you're going to get to talk to, hopefully, because they're like such a big deal and you might not be able to talk to them if you don't have a little bit of a connection. And so Bob decided that he was going to reach out through Adam Grant, just a little somebody you might realize from the pot. Yeah, Leidy's a big deal, to get to able to have a connection with Leidy so that he could have a conversation with him, which has eventually inspired a decent amount of work and collaboration. And without getting to know Leidy very personally yet, I can feel that already in his work and his expertise. So he is a professor at the University of Virginia, where he is traditionally in like engineering and architecture, but more and more in his work, people describe him as a designer. Some of us would interpret that in many different ways, I think, on the call. I know that means different things to my life. He has published in some really incredible places. So I think today you're going to get to see the side of him that is how his work applies to our real lives, which to me is one of the most meaningful parts of doing this type of work. But I can't underscore enough the fact like the theoretical rigor that has gone into his work in publishing in places like Nature and Science. I think Nature currently has about a 7% acceptance rate of all the submissions. In fact, they reject 40% of them without even reading them. And his work has been featured there. So it's a true honor to get to interact with someone, I think, who has such academic rigor on the theory and the science behind the effects that he shares about, and also a passion and an ability to translate that to real application. We're going to get a taste of some of that today and get to ask him some questions. But Leidy, thank you for being with us. We're super excited to have you. I can't think of someone that is more fitting to the Masters of Creativity title. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. I should fill in the details on the Sutton Grant introduction. So I get this email in my inbox from Adam Grant that's, you know, Bob Sutton asking for an introduction. And my response was, this is like Bill Russell, that being Bob, asking Michael Jordan, that being Adam, for an introduction to some guy who's just hoping to get drafted. Because for academics who write books, there's no bigger names than Bob and Adam. And I would have responded to Bob without the intro from Adam, definitely.
They think very highly of you. I love it.
No, it's been really fun to have the collaboration with him, and I'm thrilled to be here. These are my people. I come at this from a design angle, but let me I'm going to just share a little bit here, and then we'll have time for conversation and for me to fill in some of the interesting bits too as part of the conversation. But what we're talking about today all started, I've got a replica. I was playing Legos with my son Ezra there, and he was 3 at the time. We played a lot of Legos. We still do play a lot of Legos. And the problem we had was basically this. We were building a bridge and it wasn't level. And so I turned around behind me to fix it, to grab a block to add to the shorter column. By the time I had turned back around, my son Ezra had removed a block from the longer column and was building away with his level bridge. And I'm, so what happened in that moment is really close cognitively to what we found through a lot of studies that I'll take you through really briefly in a second here, that when we try to make something better, when we try to change something from how it is to how we want it to be, that's my go-to definition of design. And that's, something that we all do in many ways all the time. When we try to change something from how it is to how we want it to be, why is it that our first instinct is to think, hey, what can we add to this? And only subsequently, or with a little more effort, or with some reminders, might we think about subtracting. It seems like we're missing out on a whole category of options. Now, of course, you need to do more serious research than just playing with your kid to publish it in Nature. So I worked with some great collaborators, Ben Converse, Andy Hales, and Gabe Adams, who's a Stanford PhD, and also trained in social psychology. We got more serious with the Lego studies, and we wanted to show that, or see if people would fail to subtract to their detriment. So that's, that the combination of that question, the Lego inspiration, plus Ben has a kid about the same age as Ezra, and they were both growing out of their superhero phases. So we had these action figures around, led to the Stormtrooper sandwich paradigm. And what we tasked people with doing here was to balance a masonry block on top of this structure. Okay. And so if you just put a block on top of there now, it will collapse. It's not stable. And the dominant response, the additive response, is to fill in that top layer, either with blocks in every spot, or blocks on the corners. The correct fewest changes response is to subtract the block in the far corner, move the platform down, and then you've got a stable platform to protect the Stormtrooper. And people overlooked that as a way to make things better after they were told that, hey, look, would you have done this if you had thought of it? They said yes, definitely. And so this was really useful because it showed us that people were overlooking subtraction, not just because it was well, to their detriment, right? So it's one thing to think of something and then not choose it. This is showing that they're not even thinking of it. But it's a very specific context, right? You're like, big deal, Leidy. This shows that people overlook it when they're trying to protect a Stormtrooper from a masonry block in this convoluted setup. We studied this a lot of different ways, and I'll just skim through some of these, but we had a natural experiment of request for ideas from university stakeholders. So we're at the University of Virginia. We had a new president come in before the pandemic, and what's the first thing a new president does? Says, okay, we're going to do our strategic plan. This starts with a request for ideas. The ideas that suggested subtracting elements were only about 8%. And this was probably professors like me and Bob saying we should subtract administrators or certain things, but still only 8% suggested removing elements. We did it with block structures. We did it with writing. When we got to writing, we were kind of like, let's try to find a context where people do subtract. In the thinking with writing being that, Strunk and White's classic advice is omit needless words. And that's the most assigned textbook on college and high school syllabi. Surely people would be inclined to subtract when writing, but when we asked people to improve summaries, they added words. Even when we asked people to improve other people's summaries, they added words. And then another one was a day trip itinerary. So again, this started with Legos, but it applies in all of these times when we're trying to change something from how it is to how we want it to be. And the day trip itinerary was this ridiculous adventure in Washington, D.C., where people went to 14 different places and significant places like the Smithsonian Museum, the Lincoln Memorial, places that you could spend a whole day at. There were 14 different things in a drag and drop interface, and people could change their itinerary, and people added stuff into the itinerary much more than they subtracted from it. So we've got all these cases. I think the most convincing one, and the one that I like the most, and the one you can play around with most as an experiment, is this one. The problem with all of those other scenarios is you could say, well, yeah, that's just writing, or that's just what we're conditioned to do when we're playing with Legos, or that's just what we do when we're traveling. So we needed a situation where it's like people didn't have prior experience trying to make this thing better. And that's why we came up with this grid design. And the goal here is, as it says, what's the simplest way to make the design symmetrical from left to right and top to bottom? And this is one example of the grids. We had a number of different examples, but they were all basically the same in that there were extraneous marks in one quadrant. And now that you've been primed with all of my talk about subtraction, you know that the simplest way is to take away the 4 blocks in the upper corner there. What most people still do is add to the other 3 corners, which is not the simplest way. It does create symmetry, but not in the simplest way. So all this put together, again, the punchline is back to what happened, me playing Legos with Ezra, with a lot of scientific evidence behind it, that we process things, we think in stages, we can't think of everything all at the same time. And it seems like when we're thinking about how we change something from how it is to how we want it to be, our first thought tends to be, hey, what can we add to this thing? And then the reason we make mistakes is we say, what can we add? And we move on without considering whether subtraction might have been a better option. So, back to the grids here. Once you told people, oh, look, you could have subtracted, they said, oh yeah, that's obvious. Or if you reminded them that they could add or subtract, they became more likely to subtract. Or if you had them do repetitions and come up with it themselves, which by the way is the reason that Ezra came up with the subtraction in Legos. He's not a good subtractor. He just does a lot of Legos. If you have them do repetitions, they'll then recognize the subtractive option as correct if they stumble upon it. So we think of it first, move on think of adding first and move on without considering if subtraction could be better. And this was on the cover of Nature, but partly because nobody cured COVID that week. It was April of last year, and also because I think less is more has a catchy phrase. I think the more important thing here is the subtitle that the authors actually got to write, and that's why subtractive changes actually require more thought, right? So less is more gets thrown around, and I think one of the traps we can fall into is that less is easy, and the case here is that it actually requires more thought. My book came out 6 days after the paper, which was like the biggest, I think it's unprecedented in the history of writing books, and it was very nerve-wracking because the first chapter of the book was essentially the Nature paper, so of course I can't publish the book before the Nature paper comes out. So you've got these like parallel publishing things going on and completely out of my control. And I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to tell the publisher they need to hold off on the book because Nature's going to put it on the cover. But it all worked out. And then the book came out, and in the book, and it takes that fundamental insight. That fundamental insight is the first chapter of the book, and then talks about why this might be, and what we can do about it. So a couple of highlights. There are lots of reasons for any behavior, right? If we have this decision-making shortcut, there's likely biological reasons, cultural reasons, economic, social reasons. There's some surprising biological reasons. One that's not surprising is just that acquiring things has been good for passing down our genes, right? If the people who stockpile food when times are good make it better through scarce times, not just people, but any kind of living thing. The one that's a little more surprising that it's biological is this desire to display competence. And this is something that I struggle a lot with when I find myself not subtracting, is we want to show that we can effectively interact with the world. So the story in the book here is about bower birds. These are the birds that build the ceremonial nests, and the males build a fancy nest. The females go around, look at the nests, decide which male to mate with based on which nest they like the best. And then the female goes and builds a nest to shelter the young. So there's no function to the male built nests other than to show that this male is good at collecting sticks, which suggests that it's effective at interacting with the world, which suggests that it might be a good bird to kind of merge your genes with. So and this desire to display competence it's in the physical world, but Albert Bandura, Stanford professor, extended this notion of competence to completion of tasks, right? So when you attend that meeting, or when you check something unimportant off your to-do list, you feel like you're displaying competence by these task completions. And so what does this have to do with adding and subtracting? Well, when you subtract something, the evidence isn't there of the competence. You may very well be being competent in subtracting, but if you take some feature off of the app, you take something off of the building, pretty soon it's out of sight and out of mind, and it's harder to display competence. So that's a biological thing that we have to contend with. And again, the point of knowing these is by understanding why we're doing this, that's what's going to help us find more of our options going forward. there are, just as biology evolves, culture evolves. I think there's a really powerful case to be made that for a very long time in our history, as we've been developing civilization, adding has simply been the better way to make change. I'm sure we'll talk about in the questions the Embarcadero Freeway. I opened the book with the story of this double-decker highway that was removed from the waterfront in San Francisco, and revealed this one of the most visited places in the world, and how hard that was. But that's a relatively new opportunity. When there were no roads, the main option was to build roads, right? That was how you made things better. And so a lot of our subtracting opportunities, whether from organizations or cities or even our ideas, have required things to be added there in the first place. So some of these opportunities are relatively new, and for a long time, adding has been the better way to advance civilization. And all cultures, at least the dominant ones, kind of share this heritage. I want to touch quickly on economics, mainly to say that a lot of people, their first thing is, well, yeah, this is capitalism's fault that we only add. And it's like, no, this is like, capitalism doesn't shape our basic cognition. It certainly doesn't when the focus on growth, which is actually relatively new, kind of post-World War II, where GDP became this dominant metric, that does privilege adding, right? It's easier to show growth in your GDP by adding things than by taking them away. But these economic reasons that we add are much, I think, more kind of symptom than cause of a more basic cognitive oversight. So two more conceptual slides here that I think are really useful and I think break down some misconceptions that people have. So I talked about less is more, and there's a real challenge here that when people hear less, they think, okay, this is going to be easy. It's not going to require work. And that's the opposite of what we find cognitively, and also what we find physically in the real world, right? To subtract something, you have to think past your first instinct. You can think about adding almost, it's second nature, but to subtract, you actually have to think, okay, past that first instinct and think about other options. So it's a little bit more thinking, and also it's more kind of logistical work in the world, right? So to subtract something, you have to have added something in the first place. If you're a designer and you want to, or I'll go with a writing example. I do a lot of writing. I think that's my main form of design. If I want to subtract words from my writing, I have to have written them first. So to get to 150 words after I've written 250 requires you to write all 250 and then subtract 100 more. It's more work to get to less. And there are certainly times when this lazy less, don't do anything is the right approach. But what we're talking about here is the act of subtracting is what takes you to this less on the other side of more, where a lot of the untapped potential is. And then the other conceptual thing I think is important to understand is this visibility and the feedback cycle that creates. And again, lots of reasons for any behavior, but there's a lot of reinforcement going on here where, we think of adding first, and then there are more additions in the world as we walk around in that world, whether it's, physical additions or social additions, meetings, networks, ideas. The additions are there reminding us all the time that adding can be a good way to make change. Subtractions are not visible, right? And so you take something away, you might remember for a little while that the Embarcadero was subtracted. And, I'm sure there's signs there describing that it was subtracted, but I visited there with Ezra was about 2 at the time. We went and made balloon animals. It was first on my wife's to-do list for seeing San Francisco. And then I was like, oh my goodness, this is the place that Trip was one of my students who knew I was interested in this kind of design. This is the place that Trip told me about, I think. And I had to go back and check and see, oh, look, this in fact is the place where they subtracted the highway. So the evidence just isn't there when you subtract. And this creates a feedback loop that we need to interrupt if we want to make subtraction more a part of our processes. And so one way is to think of it more, but also when you do think of it, trying to figure out ways to make it visible. And the last slide I have is a little bit of inspiration and a little bit of making sure that neither of my kids gets a complex. This is my daughter Josephine, who's now the same age as Ezra when he was playing with Legos, and she's on her Strider bike, which I think shows the beautiful potential of subtraction. And if you're not familiar with these bikes, they're pedalless, and they make it so that Josie could ride this before she was 2. The kid gets on top of it, straddles it, propels with their feet like a Flintstones vehicle, and after about an hour on the bike, it turns out they can balance. So she's coasting down hills. This freedom of mobility, the pride. I mean, if you look at her face there, I mean, that's just priceless. So it's this invention that has helped kids have joy for 2 more years in their lives. I'm disappointed that it wasn't invented when I was a kid. And the whole insight was, hey, what if we subtract the pedals and the drivetrain? And Ryan McFarland, who invented the Strider bikes, his design process is outlined in the book, and he goes through how he was basically thinking about how to make the bike lighter weight, and that led him down this path of subtracting these things. Then he realized that the kid could provide the balance, which I think is a beautiful example of human-centered design too, right? Because the breakthrough here requires not just thinking about the bike, but thinking about the bike and the person that's using the bike, and realizing that the person can provide a function that has historically been, placed on the bike itself. Sold a lot of bikes, made the world a better place, and the breakthrough was in subtracting. And in the history of, the evolution of bike design, there've been fatter tires, bigger tubes, more gears, little baskets on the bike that Josephine is partaking in there, and the bells and stuff like that. All these additions, and it took a really long time for somebody to come up with this subtraction that made things a lot better. So that's the potential. I think we've got. I'm really looking forward to discussing this with you all. I'm sure I'll learn just as much as you, and I'll be able to share some of my additional thoughts as part of that conversation. So thanks for listening.
Leidy, thank you so much. Such a great introduction with some of the basic principles of how we got to this place of adding more, and some examples. There's one question in the chat I thought we might start with, and then I'll ask folks, if you are reading the chat and you see a question you want us to definitely answer, if you would just say +1 and the person's name, we'll try to pull those questions to the top and get to answer what you would like to have answered, even though I know we won't quite get to everything. There's been so many great comments. One of the funniest comments, I think, is between our 2 backgrounds, and I will say mine is not less cluttered behind the fake background. It's clear who the expert of subtraction is. I love it.
Practice what I preach. I'll have to like the rest of my office is a little cluttered. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's okay. We've got some tough critics in the audience saying, could the book have been shorter? So maybe we'll get to some of the tougher questions. But for now, would you mind sharing one of the articles you posted on Twitter recently that featured some of your work is one about where can we see this applied? And it happened to be in an academic arena there, but I think sometimes that relates to many of us coming from a professional world. I know a lot of people I see on the call are some of our executive education students. Can you give us a couple of examples of places where you've seen people apply subtraction, and what are those that have worked, or just kind of broaden our minds to ways we see this already practiced by some, I guess, experts in their way of practicing subtraction in the field?
Yeah, I mean, like having the meetings, I really like that suggestion from the article, which that was one of the things that Bob and I have worked on together. And we figured, we know academia, we know how this operates, and it's similar at an organizational level to a lot of other organizations. And so this rule of halves, which is, have the number of meetings, have the time of the meetings, have the number of participants in the meetings. And Bob even said, like, create a halftime to the meetings where the people who feel like they're not getting anything out of it or contributing anything to it are, encouraged to leave. And so the reason that I like that is, and I think that it is effective, is it prevents you from overlooking subtraction as an option. It also takes away this competence barrier, right? We want to show that we're doing great at work, and the easiest way, absent any of these rules, is to do more and add these things. But if you say this is what we're going to try to do, then you can display competence by by subtracting some of the meetings and things like that. So that's one that I think is broadly applicable from that article.
Wow, that is such a great one. It reminds me a little bit of, was it Dropbox that enforced our meeting get-in as a strong example of subtraction? I think one of my fears in reading your book is thinking, even smart people that know they should do this can't always do it. And we're actually assisted by nature or events out of our control sometimes, like the earthquake in San Francisco that you write about. But I guess a follow-up question to that is, have you seen ways that people have made a big impact, whether by nature, their own choosing, or something like our meeting get-in, which was just this company-wide announcement that they were going to remove all recurring meetings? Is that what happened?
Yeah, and I think this is I'm giving you more Stanford examples, but this is a good example. The AstraZeneca, they did a case study of AstraZeneca, right? And what's really cool about that case study is they empowered their employees to come up with subtractions. And I think that something like 60,000 employees could come up with subtractions big and small. And it was things from, hey, you can only write a 250 word email. I forget what the exact limit was. And if you want to CC more people, you can, but you have to override something. And to more consequential things like meetings and departments and things like that. But 60,000 people saved more than 1 million hours, I think maybe even closer to 2 million hours. And what another thing that I like about that is that they were very focused on kind of the end state as opposed to the individual subtractions. One of the reasons it's hard to take things away is because you feel like you're losing something, but of course we're taking away in all of these cases to make the overall situation better. And so AstraZeneca was really focused on, this will be time for research, or this is like our core mission. This is what we do. And this will free up those millions of hours for that core activity. And so I think that that's, both a powerful example of, hey, this can be done in a large organization, but also shows how they're, knowingly or not, using the science a little bit, the cognitive science, to their advantage, and not focusing on the individual things that are getting subtracted, but focusing on the better end state that will result.
Yeah. I'm scrolling back up through chat because there was a question that was to that point, and maybe I'll ask Jeremy or others to help me pull up the questions in chat that we'd really like to get your expert thoughts on. Because adding is so easily rewarded, can you help us understand or give examples of ways that you can reward subtraction or make the end game more enticing? I didn't realize it was going to happen, but what you just said now I think is a great example of that. Subtraction for what is a way of showing the end benefit of subtracting, when I think the immediate reaction to subtraction doesn't have some of those positive reactions cognitively or socially. Are there other examples of ways we could make subtracting feel more enticing in the moment because we know it's good for us long term?
Yeah, not say subtraction is one of them. I see a question in there about linguistics, and I used it as the title of the book because it's provocative and singular. I mean, there's no other books titled that, but I mean, one of the reasons there's no other books titled that is because there's a negative valence around subtraction, and so the people can do these analyses of words and say, what's your initial reaction to them, and words like subtract, and it's not as bad as moist, but it's not one that makes you feel good when you hear it. And so I want to change the valence. I want that to be viewed as a positive thing. But until then, use different words. I mean, you can say edit, trim, prune, clean, carve, reveal, and kind of talk about your subtractions in different ways that will get people past that initial negative reaction. And I mean, that's a little bit of marketing, but and I was asked, this is great because I got asked this question before and I didn't have a good answer. It's like, the question is basically like, how do you sell these things and how do you get other people to buy in? I mean, Zoom is a very subtractive technology, right? And Zoom, they're making a lot of money by subtracting commuting, right? And so I'm not as worried about, I think if you add value, the marketers will figure out how to kind of reward this thing. It's the same with the balance bike. I'm not convinced that that people only care about, getting some physical thing. If you can make it actually better, I think that's the main first step, and then worry about how to either describe it differently, focus on the good things that it does and not what's been taken away. But that's doable.
And Leidy, or Catherine, I'll just share it with you and you can determine whether it should pass the filter to get to Leidy. It's related to what he just mentioned, but Alexander Moore, I thought, asked a great question. How do you get buy-in from people that may feel possessive of what you're thinking of removing? And I couldn't help but think of the notion of loss aversion, that someone values something, or I don't know what it is, endowment effect. That's it. Someone values something more whenever you offer to take it, right? Like your IKEA shelf, I'll take that off your hands. It's like, I put a lot of work into that, right? And so I wonder just the intersection of Alexander's question and this idea of the endowment effect and what has been endowed onto things that we have added to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it brings up a whole host of kind of, after you get out of like the science that we put in nature is just the thinking process. And of course, thinking just happens with one person. And even after you think of something, you still have to choose it. There's reasons why you wouldn't choose it that are seemingly irrational. One of them being that it's harder to lose something than it is to gain something of the same value. And then you go into these like social things if all of these decisions are made in groups, right? And so I think it's a great question about, okay, one, what do you do when people are possessive of their own ideas? And I think that I think it also works both ways, right? I sometimes hesitate to subtract things that I think should be subtracted because I don't want to offend somebody, right? And it's a calculus that's going on. I'm like, okay, well, yeah, this isn't the exact right thing to do, but I also want this person to speak up next time they have an idea, and so maybe we can kind of like massage it in and make them feel like the contribution is still there, and but at the same time, do the design that's best. But I also appreciate that there's times where you kind of, going back to Kim Scott, just be radically candid and be like, no, this isn't good. And if you do that enough times, then people realize that it's not the idea, and it's not the person, that it's just the idea. It's not a big deal. So I think all the typical ways of just, kind of good group dynamics are important there. Also being aware of it. All of these things start with ourselves, right? I mean, if we can be aware when we're doing this, kind of holding on to an idea that's ours, and that would benefit the group if we subtracted, that's a good thing. I do think assigning other people to do the subtracting makes a little bit of sense. I mean, this is why there's the whole profession of editors. Not the only reason. They do a lot of amazing generative contributions, but it's really hard to subtract from your own work. And one way to help with that is to get a second opinion. And it could be a second opinion that but also even like anonymous editors, right? So now you're subtracting and the people don't know who did it, and there's that, like, kind of breaks that tension between the people. I also love the question because it brings up a really important point where it would be pretty obnoxious to go into a situation and think that's a complex situation, which all of these things we're talking about are, and think that right away that you should subtract something from that situation that could make it better, right? If you don't understand how a system works, like even going back to the Embarcadero example, me going up to the waterfront, seeing a double-decker highway there and being like, oh, we should get rid of this. This is making the city worse. I mean, that's ridiculous because I don't understand what other benefits it's providing. There's this whole system that's tied in there. So I think it is a good first instinct not to subtract from stuff that other people have thought about more than you have. But once you've like kind of carefully studied the system and think that subtraction is an option, then you can follow through with it. I don't know. Does that satisfactory?
I think it really helps. A couple things that it brought to mind for me is I know some people have renamed CEO to be chief editing officer. Like, what if
Oh,
you
really?
thought about it like that? Maybe that's a
Yeah,
Bob Feminism, I'm not sure. But that who owns the responsibility of subtracting, I think is a great question when it's not naturally incentivized.
mhm.
And two things you're bringing up, which I'm reminded of, are from the book, that both your ability to see the bigger picture, I might not be using the right words, but both the foreground and the background of the context of how and why something exists actually allows you to be better at subtracting. And you bring a cool concept saying bringing your multiple selves to subtraction, it makes it easier for you. I think of that as something that the D-school really connects with, is like the best way to solve a problem is to have a lot of perspectives on it. And while that might exist in you as a parent, in you as an engineer, in you as a teacher, like, right, each of us have multiple perspectives ourselves, but when you brought in the group of what we should subtract with more perspectives, I wonder if it's a little counterintuitive that feels like scary, dangerous, intruding on people's things that they own, but it would actually help us be better subtractors if we did it as as a group, what you're mentioning, that being an important context to this.
Yeah, I think so. Because you'd have the more perspectives, more chances to stumble on it, and then once people, in these cases where it's just inarguably the right thing to do, that would definitely work. And I love the multiple selves kind of brings up some important points, in that one important point is it's not only subtract, right? It's add and subtract. We need to do both of these. These are complementary approaches to making change. And the problem comes often when we use this like binary thinking approach, where it's like, okay, this concept is true, so this other concept must not be true. And that works sometimes, but not when the concepts aren't in opposition, right? And in this case, as we're talking about it in terms of design, these are arguably the two fundamental ways to change something. And so they're complements. If instead of thinking of them as opposites, if our first thought was add and then we immediately thought of subtracting right after, we wouldn't have a problem. The other cultural thing, I mean, the other question that comes up is, oh, are there groups that are better at this? And I spent a lot of time like looking in the literature for it. We even did some studies that kind of poked around at it and didn't find any evidence that's like, oh, women are better than men, or young people are better than old people, or Eastern cultures are better than Western cultures, to the extent that any culture is, a single thing. But the selves comes from Hazel Marcus's work. So another Stanford person, believe it or not, and her work on cultural psychology, showing that we all have multiple selves, kind of taking this from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. It's like, I contain multitudes, and so I have my father self, I have my professor self, I have my kind of crabby editing self, I have my generative let's make up some cool stories self. And you can draw on those at different times to help you see different opportunities to take away. I love it. Even goes into like Ryan McFarland, the Strider bike rider, talks about how the engineer in him was thinking about the pedals or something like that, but the father in him was thinking about the kid. And so he has, he used these multitudes in coming up with that innovation.
So cool. Somebody in the chat was thinking about the brakes. So they're referencing another multitude of themselves. Somebody is asking, and it's been being +1 a lot. I think particularly relevant, at least to a period of time where online shopping has gone through the roof in many ways. Anya from Slovenia asks, when we acquire or buy things, dopamine gets released. What does science know about brain chemistry when we subtract things?
Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't release the dopamine. Yeah.
Okay, hit us with the hard stuff first. That's the bad news.
I think I think, yeah, that's very powerful force working in favor of addition, is that, and then not only, the buying the things releases dopamine, but these processes, the people who are getting you to buy things know that it releases dopamine and set up the processes to help release the dopamine. I mean, it's the same with Twitter and some other things. So I think one is, as the designer of these processes, you could figure out ways to like kind of get subtraction to release dopamine, along the way as you're doing the process, right? So, Jeremy mentioned the IKEA effect, or like this I built it effect. And when you're subtracting, it's fun. I mean, that releases dopamine. When I don't know if it's dopamine, it's something. When I'm editing, I'm in a state of flow, right? The psychology of optimal experience, where I'm like completely immersed in the thing that I'm doing. So it's not that we can't have good experience when we're subtracting, but it's certainly true that a lot of these additive things kind of tie into that, that release of dopamine and the desire, the desire to feel that.
Thanks. I like to think of micro dopamine hits, or at least micro positive energy while you're doing something that's, hard and challenging. I think there's a lot of cool research on long-term goals, and like savings for retirement basically is very different when you are close to achieving that goal than when you're far away from it, which many of us might feel. I think I feel like that in life right now, that I'm very far away from subtraction, or a life that looks like subtraction. And so what can be the small motivators that get me there is very powerful. Okay, there's something in chat, which Jeremy just alerted me to. I think if it's possible, if Andrea is okay with this, Andrea, would you be willing to share your question regarding Nike? It would be kind of fun if it just came from you. And if you feel comfortable, just pull you up on here, or, if you signal camera off, we'll try to read the room, but it'd be fun to get another voice up here. Andrea, would you like to share your question?
It's her example, actually. Andrea's got an amazing example of subtraction at Nike.
Cool, let's hear it. Thanks.
Hi, thanks so much, team. I was just thinking around the lines of the discussion about subtraction, and something we recently did at Nike was to reduce and subtract the amount of categories of product, and the fact that it affects a whole different amount of organizational team players, with the order management team, the buyers, the suppliers, when we try to have a men's category for running, a men's category for soccer, a men's category, instead of just being men's, right? Just overall overreaching, just men's, and here are the list of styles and product that we're going to put under this umbrella, and the same for women and kids. And I think that it's really, really reaped a great benefit for all of us. And I am an inventory operations manager, so it has definitely helped my life a lot better.
Oh, cool.
I love that example, Andrea. I've got a Nike example in the book, but it's physical. I contend that the Nike Air is a subtractive innovation, right? It's like all this, hey, but who thought to like take out part of the shoe, and then instead of calling it a subtraction, you called it Air, and then the thing I like about it too is that, and I don't think this explains all of the reasons it was successful. I think Michael Jordan helped with that, but but making it visible was really, there was this period, and this was like in my formative teenage years, there's this period where it's like, this is Nike Air, and you had to like break your shoe open to see it. But then they're like, oh, if we put this window, then people can see it. And all of a sudden, like, less became noticeable, and people used it. So I'll have to send you a book, because I talk about Tinker Hatfield and like the origins of Nike. But I love that category example too, and it ties really well in. One of the guys I work with, Eric Johnson, has a really good book called The Elements of Choice, and he talks about how you structure decisions. And one of the things in there is like, if you can overwhelm people with too many categories, and so there's an optimal number. And so thanks for sharing the example.
Yeah.
Sure.
So cool, Andrea. I love that. Thank you for being willing to jump up here with us. I really appreciate it. It's fun to get other voices and thoughts.
Anytime.
This time has gone so quickly. It always does. I thought when we thought it was going to be a short talk, that then we felt like there'd be plenty of time for questions. And there's 1,000 questions I'd rather ask in chat than get offline right now, which I guess just points to the power and difficulty of subtraction. I want to do a couple of things, I think, with our last little bit of time. First, I want to thank you, Leidy, for being with us. I think in introducing you that I actually got so excited to get to hear from you that I failed to announce the actual title of the book. I have been reading it on my iPhone, which isn't kind of as cool because I can just like hold it up. But Leidy's book is called Subtract. It's the Untapped Science of Less. Yeah, Jeremy's got the hard copy there. I've got my soft copy on Audible here. And it came out I think about a year ago exactly. Is that about right?
Yeah, the hard copy came out like mid-April last year, but the paperback just came out. I've got this is a cool subtractive example. I think there are some people on here from China too. So there's the two Chinese versions. There's simplified and complex Chinese, and I didn't know this before, but so simplified Chinese is basically like a stripped down version of the language, and it's spread further because more people can then speak it.
Wow.
It's an example
a
of
cool
subtraction in
example.
action. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the tangibility of that. And I didn't know about that actually. So thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for your insight in sharing research that is so well founded in the science that you've conducted, and then also being willing to share very practical examples from your personal life for our personal lives and the questions we were wondering. It's so fun to get to be in conversation with you. So thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I mean, thanks everybody for the work that you do. I mean, I spend time thinking and writing, and I really care about having an impact on the world, and it's only through people like you all. So I appreciate all the design work that everybody's doing in all these different contexts. Keep up the good work.